Hello. October 1986 was the release of two Doctor Who novels in paperback, the novelization of Fury from the Deep, which we discussed last week on episode 109 of this podcast, and also the release of the companions of Doctor Who, Harry Sullivan's War, which is the subject of this coming episode. October 1986 was also, for any Mets fan under the age of 55 years old, the greatest month in baseball history in your lifetime. As I've discussed earlier on this show, in June 1977, the Mets traded away who had been the greatest pitcher, player in franchise history up to that point, George Thomas "Tom" Seaver. Following that trade, the Mets collapsed into a long succession of last place teams between 1977 and 1983. But thanks to new ownership and better management, a shrewd selection of trades and rookie draft picks, the Mets started to get good the last 2 months of 1983 and then finished in second place in their division in 1984 and 1985. 1986, the Mets won their first two games and then lost the next three after that. But then they won 11 straight games in April 1986 and never looked back. They won 2 out of every 3 games they played that year. And when you're talking about a 162-game baseball season that goes from April through early October, that is a lot of wins. 108 to be precise. 8 wins less than the major league record, but 108 wins is a remarkable achievement, and the Mets made the playoffs for the first time in 13 years. The last time they had been in the playoffs before October 1986 was the month I was born, when they ended up losing the World Series in heartbreaking fashion to the Oakland A's, who, as of this week, are no longer the Oakland A's, but are just the A's. But that's a story for Ross Aiken to bring to you on his own podcasts. Terrible story there. But the October 1986 playoffs were a series of miraculous twists and turns. The Mets had to play 2 postseason series that year, the National League Championship Series against the Houston Astros, who had entered the National League the same year as the Mets, expansion teams in 1962, and who had never won a World Series up to that point in their history. The Mets lost 2 of the first 4 games in that series to a pitcher named Mike Scott, who had been a Mets rookie and then was traded away for relatively nothing after the 1982 season and became the greatest pitcher in Astros history after the Mets gave up on him. But pitchers do not pitch every day, and just as well for the Mets because they had much less trouble with every pitcher on the Astros staff not named Mike Scott, and they won that series in 6 games, 1 less than the maximum. The final game, played on my birthday, went 16 innings, almost twice regulation length, and is widely regarded as one of the best baseball games ever played. That brought the Mets to the World Series against the Boston Red Sox of the American League, a cursed franchise that had not won the World Series at that point since 1986. The first 2 games were played at home for the Mets in Shea Stadium in Queens, New York, and they lost the first 2 games at home. Things seemed bleak. The Mets traveled to Boston. They won games 3 and 4 on enemy turf, Fenway Park in Boston, but the Mets lost game 5 and then came home, and they had to win both of the last 2 games, both played at Shea Stadium. If they lost game 6, the World Series was over. At the very end of game 6, the Mets were losing 5-3 with 2 outs, nobody on base, 1 more out, and their season would have been over for all time. But then they got a single, another single that scored a run, made it 5-4, and then because the Red Sox were cursed, even though they were 1 strike away from winning that game on a few occasions, a wild pitch scored the tying run, and then a fluke ground ball by the Mets' fastest runner, Mookie Wilson, was supposed to be an out, but ended up skipping through the legs of the Red Sox injured first baseman, Bill Buckner, who ordinarily would have been taken out for defensive purposes before the end of the game, but the Red Sox manager was sentimental and wanted him to be on the field when the Red Sox clinched the championship. That scored the winning run, and the Mets had tied Game 6 in the most unlikely and improbable fashion. I should point out this was not the fault of Bill Buckner that he did not catch the ball. He did receive a lot of grief for it over the next few decades. Mookie Wilson was a very fast runner and would have been safe anyway, and the tying run probably would have scored anyway, even if not for the error, but it was a shocking moment, and these things do have a way of writing their own narratives. But the World Series was not over at that point. There was still one more game left to play, and there was a rainout on Sunday night, so the game was delayed and played on Monday. The Red Sox quickly jumped out to a 3-0 lead over the Mets, but destiny has a way of hurting you even when you're winning 3-0 late in the game. The Mets came back and won 8-5, winning the World Series on their home turf. One of the greatest months in the history of New York Mets baseball, every postseason game a classic. The Mets were a proud team, some would say arrogant. Many of their players would later have problems with substance abuse or criminal encounters, and the team never duplicated the greatness of 1986. They have never again won 108 games in a season. They have never again won a World Series, even though that was now almost 38 years ago. Here's the funny thing about the Mets winning the World Series in 1986. I was not watching. I was not paying attention. I did not watch a single pitch of that World Series, or the playoffs, or the regular season. Did not watch a single game. Why? Doctor Who. I became a Mets fan in 1981, 1982. I became a Doctor Who fan in 1984. It is possible to have multiple fandoms, but at some point the love of Doctor Who overtook the love of the Mets, and I stopped watching baseball in the middle of 1985. Did not think about it at all for a good 2 years. I was aware, because I was going to school in suburban New York, that the Mets won the World Series, but I had no emotional reaction one way or the other. It wasn't until the summer of 1987 when I started to drift away from Doctor Who and re-embraced Mets fandom, and I was a rabid baseball fan for the next several years. Doctor Who, of course, eventually returned my affections. Right now, I have not followed Major League Baseball at all since 2019. I am still an archival Mets fan of their history, but I go to very few games, do not like supporting current team ownership. But that's no problem, because the Mets have not been in the World Series since 2015, and the way this season has shaken out, we are 1 week into the 2024 baseball season, the Mets do not seem to be in danger of winning 108 games or going to the playoffs at all. But it's a fun fact of my life that the greatest month in my lifetime in Mets history occurred when I just wasn't paying attention at all. Of course, in October 1986, I was also not paying attention to the companions of Doctor Who. I was buying the novelizations, but pretty much nothing else. I had not read Turlough and the Earthling Dilemma, which came out earlier this year, and I would not read October 1986's Harry Sullivan's War until March 2024, which is the subject of our show this week.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody, welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason. We're going to jump right into it this week with Jim Sangster talking us through Harry Sullivan's War. Just a couple of things to point out. Dale Smith was on this show last month for Doctor Who, The Companions, Turlough and the Earthling Dilemma. A few days after that episode released, Dale guest wrote an essay for the great James Courray Smith about Turlough and the Earthling Dilemma, including a lot of original research, some of which we did not have time to get into on this show. I highly recommend that essay, and I will include a link to it in the show notes. This week, my guest is Jim Sangster. And Jim has recorded a song for us and made a video as well. The song was written by Jim, and the vocals are by Anthony Owen. I would ordinarily have played this as the cold open, but it is the October 1986 book, and I had to get that baseball anecdote out. Fear not, my non-baseball fan listeners, which is almost all of you. There are going to be very few baseball essays going forward, except for one next week based on unfortunate current events. But let's give a spin to the new hit single, Go Harry Go. And after that, well, let's get to it.
Who can you trust when all hope is gone? 10 years are lost from unit to alone. Now where is she? A strange weekend, no celebration, friend or enemy. The castle calls with expectation. Go, Harry, go. Who brings a question for an answer? Go, Harry, go. A secret agent or a chancer? Go, Harry, go. The clues behind a prison door. Go, Harry, go. A fear of falling, Harry Sullivan's War.
Hello, fellow time travelers, and welcome to the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, the only podcast to discuss, in story order, all the Doctor Who novelizations. My name is Tony Whitt, and every 2 weeks or so, I'm joined by a 2 to 3 person discussion panel, including our so-called expert who's been a Who fan since 1979. That would be me. We also get the views of intermediate, casual, and novice fans who either have never seen the show or who have never read these books until these podcasts, including
Dalton Hughes
and
Alison Fitz-Seyfried.
You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you find good podcasts, or even ones like ours. You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Enjoy your travels.
So, Jim Sangster, what book are we here to discuss today?
Hello, old thing. It's not even a proper Doctor Who book. It's Harry Sullivan's War.
And before we get to the book, you are wearing a Jim Sangster sweatshirt, but I can only see the top of the head, and it appears to be...
This is probably well outside of your cultural references. In honour of the fact that Doctor Who is going to be back on our screens on the same night as Eurovision, I am wearing my t-shirt, which is a reference to the movie Eurovision, the Will Ferrell movie. So this is a very hirsute man shouting, "Play Ya Ya Ding Dong!"
See,
Which,
the
if you've not
hirsute
seen the
man
movie,
appears to be Ewan McGregor from that famous Revenge
it's
of
not
the
him.
Sith meme.
It's not him. But yeah, for anyone who knows the film, that is the standout thing that you take away from it.
I do not know the film, so my cultural references filled in the wrong answer. Speaking of Jim Sangster t-shirts, you might be surprised to learn that my likeness appears for the first time ever in issue 602 of DWM.
Does it?
It was a photo taken from the main stage at Galley 6 weeks ago, I believe during the closing ceremonies, and I am pretty prominent in the center of the photo. You can't see the entire t-shirt, but I am wearing my Jim Sangster Redbubble James Bree, no, what a stupid fool you are t-shirt. And it's partly visible in the photograph, which I believe The article, I believe, is by Simon Gurrier. Not positive who the photo credit is, and I don't have the issue yet, but this is the report that I've gotten back.
What a stupid fool you are.
That's a much better James Bree impression than I can do.
Funny enough, I've been doing impressions of James Bree ever since Trial of a Time Lord, but that was because that was just how we survived Trial of a Time Lord, by doing impressions of all of the actors.
Well, you are back for a Trial of the Time Lord novelization, but I do not believe you are back for James Bree's 2 episodes. So when I have you back for the other trial book, we're going to have to get into that.
Funnily enough, the circumstances for this book kind of correlate with Trial of a Time Lord anyway, because obviously this was the last book published during Ian Marter's life. And he died on his birthday, on the 22nd of October 1986, and the following Saturday was Bonnie Langford's first episode, which was shown live at a convention that I was working on. So it kind of all dovetails. I mean, Trial of a Time Lord casts a very long shadow for everyone who survived it on first broadcast anyway, so a lot of our thoughts go back to that moment. It's like, where were you when Trial of a Time Lord happened?
So this is late October 1986. As I discussed during the cold open, my thoughts were elsewhere in October 1986. I did not become aware of the Trial of a Time Lord season until the novelization started to trickle out. And because I got them out of order, I got Terror of the Vervoids first. So news of Perry's death, or so we believed at the time, was spoiled for me on the first page of the Terror of the Vervoids book, and my knowledge was not disabused until later on we got the Ultimate Foe and Mind Warp novelizations, which each gave alternate explanations for her survival. I did not become aware of Ian Marter's very untimely passing until the Rescue novelization came out, when it was mentioned in the editor's note, and that might have been up to a year later by the time that I saw that. So I was 13 years old in October 1986 and very much living in a Doctor Who fandom bubble. Where were you when you heard the news about Ian Marter? Because I gather you are much more centrally located than I was.
Yeah, so I was 15, and I was one of 3 people who was selected to do interviews for the Merseyside local group Fanzine, because we were having this convention, MonsterCon 2, in Liverpool, and we were looking at all of the actors who were coming up and all of the personnel who were all the guests for this convention, and deciding what sort of questions we were going to ask. And I got help from my dad, who gave me some really awful questions. One of them was, he'd got it from an old newscaster who then became a quiz show host called Wilfred Pickles. He was famous for having a northern accent on the BBC. And one of his questions was, do you have any aversions? So I dutifully trotted out my question, do you have any aversions? And every single person I asked that to said, what do you mean? I think what they meant was, are you afraid of anything, or is there anything you really particularly dislike? But it wasn't really the sort of question you should be asking Doctor Who people. Anyway, so it was me, my mate Daniel Adams, and our friend Chris Chibnall, who, I wonder what happened to him. I know what happened to him because we had a reunion last year, but we were due to be interviewing a lot of the actors. We had Louise Jameson, we had Nabil Shaban. We interviewed Victor Pemberton, who obviously wrote the book that you discussed last week with Conrad.
Fury from the Deep.
And my rubbish question to him, which actually I think in retrospect was quite a good question, was obviously our hero is Doctor Who. Who were your heroes or idols when you were younger? And he replied, I always thought that Spencer Tracy was a great screen actor. Not a great actor, but a great screen actor, if you know what I mean. And obviously, as a precocious 15-year-old, not wanting to give away the fact that I'd not actually seen a Spencer Tracy movie at this point, I nodded and went, oh yeah, I get what you mean. I had no idea. But we were due to interview Ian Marter the Friday before the convention. And so we were told in advance that he died. And we were really heartbroken because we're huge fans of his. We loved all of the books so far. I seem to remember that I got Harry Sullivan's War on the day of release because I was so desperate to read it, and I must have read it twice before the convention. But what was particularly heartbreaking was the morning after we were told. So at the event itself, and Nicholas Courtney had been asked to inform the fans at this convention. At the time, we didn't know how close their friendship was. So it was particularly heartbreaking to see this man being incredibly brave, talking about the death of his friend. What makes it slightly more surreal is I was sitting on the front row of the convention at the time, dressed as a sea devil for charity fundraising reasons. So it just becomes a bit weird. My memory of this is both tragic and ridiculous.
So your line of sight is skewed because those Sea Devil headpieces are not exactly like wearing 20/20 vision glasses, and your hearing is
You
probably
just look out the
muffled because
neck.
of the layers of latex.
You could see all around, but it is obscured. But my hearing wasn't troubled at all because Nick Courtney could project incredibly. A weird other connection. So I've just been working my way through the season 15 Blu-ray, and one of the extras on there is an interview with Louise Jameson from this very convention. And the angle that the camera is looking from is in front of where I was sitting, because I was sitting right next to the AV desk the whole way through the event. So if you want to know what that convention looked like, you'll see it on that Blu-ray because I'm sitting right next to the camera.
So almost
When
directly what you would have seen through the Sea Devil head's neck.
Yeah. There's just one other silly thing. I mean, Harry Sullivan's War is about coincidence and connections. So hopefully you'll forgive me going off on tangents because we never do that, do we? On that Friday night, as we got over the shock of Ian Marter's death, we were presented with all these costumes that had been hired by a notable fan who was great at making all these replica costumes. And so I desperately wanted to get dressed up as a Doctor Who monster. And that's how I found myself in a room with two people. I was getting dressed up, I think, as the Sea Devil. And somebody else was getting dressed up as a Sontaran. That was, I later found out, Steve Berry, who years later became a really good friend. And then the cyber controller from Attack of the Cybermen was played by Nick Pegg, who later became the Dalek operator. And we wandered around the hotel, raising money for the charity for the event. And that was how we gatecrashed a wedding. And the wedding was a relative of a Liverpool writer called Alan Bleasdale. Many years later, Alan Bleasdale wrote a drama called GBH, in which the lead character, played by Robert Lindsay, has a nervous breakdown in a hotel where there's a Doctor Who convention taking place. So it's Steve Berry's belief that we inspired the scene because of the surreal experience of being at a wedding and then looking at the dance floor and seeing Doctor Who monsters strutting their stuff.
I have to ask, Chris Chibnall, of course, famously brought the Sea Devils back to Doctor Who in 2022. We have to ask, number one, if your Sea Devil costume at that convention at which he was an attendee inspired him to want to bring back the Sea Devils all these years later.
100% yes.
And if you watch the Sea Devil and think, that should have been me in that costume.
I don't think so, no. He was never interested in it. I mean, for one thing, the stench of these costumes. I think they were owned by a fellow called Toby Chamberlain. And if you want to know how good they were, if you've got a copy of I think it's the 1981 or 82 winter special of Doctor Who Monthly, where they're reporting from Panopticon, and they've got his Davros. Pretty much every British convention for the next 10 years was using his costumes, and they were, if they weren't taken from the same molds, they were very good copies. But yeah, Toby Chamberlain's costumes. I also got to try out a pterodactyl and nearly suffocated.
Oh my!
Yeah.
I'm of the belief that Ian Marter given the complexity of his writing, might have been the one guest who understood the question, what are your aversions? This is, I don't want to say it's autobiographical because it is, after all, a spy novel. But there has to be elements of this book that are drawn direct from Ian Marter's experience or based on his personal conception of Harry Sullivan as he lived the role for one full year. I'll confess that I'd never read this book before. This is the first time that I've ever read Harry Sullivan's War in any circumstance, and as you can see, my copy is a lot more pristine than my other copies. This was purchased at a convention, and I only recently took it out of the plastic slipcase, and it's in excellent shape for a book that you buy at a convention. It's secondhand, but it almost certainly is not third, fourth, or fifth hand. And you can see my Pixel bookmark within. I didn't know what to expect when I opened this because I saw it on the bookstore shelves, 1986, 87, 88. Chose not to buy it because I was sticking just to the novelizations at that point. Two immediate impressions, and then I'll crystallize these in the audio essay after the break. Number one, this reads more like the outline of a 400-page thriller than it does a novel in and of itself, because a lot of material is glossed over. A lot of things happen in a 6-page chapter, which you would expect would take a lot more space. Scenes are summarized rather than lived. So this may have been his magnum opus, but he's dealing with a target page count, and that's why the book only goes to page 148. Second, I believe this may be unique because every other Target book to date is science fiction. And even if it's a historical, it is a historical through a sci-fi lens because you have TARDIS scenes, you have discussion of outer space concepts within the pages of the book. This appears to be just a straight spy strip. I'll say that again because I don't know what happened to my diction just there, but this happens to be a straight spy thriller. And that's the problem. I think that's one of those tongue twisters that I just inadvertently invented. And I would invite you to try saying that 5 times fast. Straight spy thriller, straight. Yeah, I'm not even going to attempt that. The point is, this is the book that confounds expectations because there doesn't appear to be any supernatural element at all, unless you can select something that is embedded in the text, which I happened to miss my first time through.
I mean, I'm not a great chemist. I'm guessing the toxins that Harry encounters, they don't seem real to me. They're very convenient. But we might say they're from the MacGuffin table of the periodic table, maybe. But yeah, I think you're right that it can confound expectations. Our friends on the Doctor Who book club kind of slated this. I mean, I know that they're usually quite mean when it comes to their marking. I'm a lot more generous than they are anyway. But they really gave this a bit of a hard time, which was what led to me telling them that they were now on my list. Which they then quoted a couple of episodes later, which, sorry guys, sorry folks. But I think that they approached it from the wrong angle. Because listening to the way that they reviewed it, it was very straightforward. It was very sort of literal. And we know from some of the the books that hadn't been published at this point, but which are coming up later on. Ian Marter was a horror writer who really wanted to be a comedy writer, I think. And there are a couple of horrific things, but this is probably one of the only books where it's still very wet, but it's wet with water rather than body fluids or pustulous monsters or whatever, or oily Cybermen. It's, Harry gets thrown in the water a lot in this.
Yes.
But it's a pastiche. I recently read the 39 Steps, the original 39 Steps, and I was shocked in a number of ways because I actually read that when I was 11 and I couldn't remember the plot because it had been overshadowed by the much superior Hitchcock version. In fact, there are 3 film versions of the 39 Steps, and all 3 of them are magnificent. But the 39 Steps, it's a bit racist. In fact, it's quite racist. It's quite anti-Semitic. But it's written from a sort of post-colonial, or actual colonial point of view. on the eve of World War One. So, you've got a few different things to consider there. But the other thing is that it was still in copyright when Harry Sullivan's War was released. It would still be in copyright until about 2010.
Huh.
So if the estate of John Buchan wanted to put a claim in, they might have had the right to, because there are a lot of similarities to the book and to the movies. It's also a Bond pastiche. But I think the clue to this book is in the very first scene, where Harry is in the gym. He's contemplating his own mortality. He's aware that he's in his early 40s, and then he's attacked, and he comes out the worse for wear. And it's a complete lift from Never Say Never Again. The difference is, in Never Say Never Again, Bond wins, whereas Harry escapes barely. And this is to remind us, Harry is not James Bond. He's also not Richard Hannay. The way he goes about his running around the moors and going back and forth to London is quite chaotic. He's not Richard Hannay. And then even when a small child gives him a jelly baby, we're reminded he's not the Doctor either. But what he is Harry Sullivan. He's a bumbler who desperately wants to do the right thing and make the best of every situation he's in. So I think it's a pastiche, which I think our friends on the Doctor Who Book Club were missing out on.
This is where the semi-autobiographical nature of the text entered my head, because that opening scene where he's attacked in the gymnasium and he later learns the identity of the person who did it, it's his 41st birthday. And of course, Ian Marter would have been 41 as he wrote this book, and he died the day that he turned 42. So this was the last full birthday he ever experienced, and it's been adapted into the text. Now, had Ian Marter still been alive today, was there any cosmic justice, we would not even have noticed this fact. But because 41 is the last full year that Ian Marter got to live, and the book takes place on Harry Sullivan's 41st, there's definitely an echo there that has unexpected resonance.
There's weird things that, because I spoke to, I'm going to sound again like a terrible name dropper, but I did work on a lot of conventions in the late 80s and through the 90s. And I spoke to Nick Courtney about his friendship with Ian Marter, and I spoke to Elizabeth Sladen, and there are little biographical details that I'm aware of that I can sense in this book. But there's, so for example, when Harry goes to visit the Brigadier on his estate, and you get a sense of him summarising the feelings that he had towards Nick Courtney, the friendship that they had there, the way that they slip into the conversation and they're reminiscing, they're nostalgic, and they're very drunken. Nick Courtney could hold his booze. But one little silly detail, he's described as wearing a white polo neck jumper or sweater. I think it's issue 46 of Doctor Who Monthly, the one with Meglos on the cover. There's a star profile, which feels to me a bit like an interview that went wrong, like they préceded the whole interview rather than having quotes of it. But anyway, on the first page of this star profile, there's a photo of Ian Marter wearing this white polo neck jumper.
Oh.
So Harry Sullivan owns the same jumper as Ian Marter. One big difference, of course, is that Ian Marter's birthday was in October, whereas Harry's is in May, which you can work out from the progression of the months through the book. But you're right, they're the same age, they've got the same face.
Yes.
And also, because of his diabetes, Ian Marter got very concerned about being healthy and started hitting the gym in his last couple of years, and so got very, very buff. So the fact that it begins in the gym, and even though he's quite hard on himself, saying he's out of shape, that's something that Ian was doing only very recently.
So as he was plotting the book and writing the scenes, this is all stuff that very much would have been in his consciousness. And having a terrestrial book without really the sci-fi dimension allows him to make it more personal in a way that might be harder to achieve if this book takes place on Space Station Nerva or clambering through the asteroid Voga, where there's less opportunity to make direct comparisons to one's activities of daily living. But I talked about this last month with Dale Smith when we were covering the first Companions of Doctor Who book, Turlough and the Earthling Dilemma, and then Dale's essay for James Courray Smith's newsletter, which came out shortly after that episode came out, where he talks about the line and how the line essentially ends after this book, and then the Canine and Company novelization is given the companion's title, but wasn't really part of the line proper. The line was already defunct at this point. Is this book a book that works? Should there have been more Companions of Doctor Who books after this one? And had Ian Marter survived, could there have been a sequel, Harry Sullivan's World War II or Harry Sullivan's War of Nerves or what have you? Does this book set up what could have been a long-running range of Harry Sullivan spy fic?
I think at the very least they wanted to do a second one. There were a number of discussions that they were having. They were thinking of doing one with Tegan, but it was a very difficult time because obviously this was very experimental. They'd only just got permission from John Layton Turner to do spin-off novels, and it's funny that obviously Ian Marter was one of the more prolific Target authors, but he also played a companion on TV, so it made sense to get him to write one of these books because he's reliable. But he really knows the characters as well. And it's not just the fact that he knows Harry. He writes Harry beautifully, but the fact that he's informed by his friendships with Liz Sladen and Nick Courtney. I think those characters, when the Brigadier and Sarah Jane slip into the story, you instantly believe that the author knows those characters inside out. They're beautifully done. But I think originally Ian had said that he wanted to kill Harry off because that's the obvious thing. You want to give them a dramatic ending. And then he suddenly realised, oh, maybe if I keep him alive, I could get a sequel out of this. So that's why I think the ending does let it down a little bit because it is a little bit inconclusive. In that the bad guys, they're slightly thwarted, but they escape to live another day. But then Smersh wasn't defeated in the first James Bond book, was it? Or
no,
or Spectre in the movies. But
Smersh is victorious at the end of Casino Royale.
Yeah, so there's another parallel. There is room for there to be another book, and I think it's a shame with all the fan writers that we've got that no one's actually tried to do. Whatever the sequel will be called, Harry Sullivan's conflict, Harry Sullivan's trauma, Harry Sullivan's broken holiday, whatever it would be. I think this is one of the books that really lends itself to a sequel, but the fact that the original was written by Ian Marter just means that maybe it would be unsatisfactory, whoever attempted that.
Having Harry Sullivan killed off in a book that hits the shelves right before Ian Marter dies would have just broken fandom fundamentally, so it's a good thing that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
David A. McKinty attempts to kill off Sarah Jane Smith in the early 2000s novel Bullet Time, and it just does not work because nobody wants to see Sarah Jane Smith killed off. I don't think Harry quite has the hold on fandom that Sarah Jane did, but in any event, when they started killing off companions left, right, and center throughout the 1990s books, it just doesn't work. I mean, people are entitled to happy endings, and not everybody's character arc needs to end in a heroic death.
I wrote a short story for one of the short trips for Big Finish, which was kind of the Fourth Doctor's unit divorce story, which was actually the opening chapters of a rejected or abandoned Missing Adventures novel, which I kept hold of and then turned into I made use of it. So the first thing is that this is why the Doctor doesn't go back to unit very much after season 13. But also, I just couldn't help myself. Sarah says to Harry, do you fancy one more trip? You've got a few weeks of leave lined up. Come and spend it with us. And he's just on the threshold of making a decision. And I just thought, I'll leave it there. So if you want to, there is a story there for someone else to pick up the baton and do the further adventures of the Doctor, Sarah, and Harry.
I'm not covering it on this show, although speaking of the Doctor Who Target Book Club, I will tease that Tony Witt is coming back within the next few weeks. I will not say for which book. But as you're aware, FASA, F-A-S-A, which did the role-playing game in the 1980s, put out two very large RPG novels, Doctor Who and the Vortex Crystal, which basically is Genesis of the Dalek, only not as good. But they had the Daleks license, and it takes place on a foreign world in the middle of a war with multiple sides and the Dalek base, and that's got the Fourth Doctor and Sarah and Harry. And every few pages there's a conflict and you have to do saving rolls, and if the Doctor dies, he regenerates and turns once again into Tom Baker. So you can die multiple times in the book before solving the crisis, and you're Tom Baker every single time. But that's not important right now. What's important is that the second and final book in the series was Doctor Who: The Rebels Gamble by the same author, William Keith, I believe. I have the books in the other room, so I'm doing this from memory. The Rebels Gamble, if memory serves, was also supposed to be a Fourth Doctor, Sarah, and Harry novel. Somebody in the licensing board said, Colin Baker is the TV Doctor now, and Tom Baker's kind of played out. Why don't we do the book now with Colin Baker and Nicola Bryant on the cover rather than Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen? So Doctor Who and the Rebels Gamble comes out as a Sixth Doctor Perry book. Problem, the book's already been written. Problem number 2, Harry Sullivan is in it. So you can't very well have a book with the Sixth Doctor and Perry, and then every third page cut out or edited this late in the day to remove all references to Harry. So it is produced as is, as a Sixth Doctor and Perry and Harry role-playing game. So it's the Sixth Doctor, Perry, and Harry running around trying to solve the American Civil War, going in chronological order. And depending on where you are in the book, you make it all the way through Gettysburg and Pickett's Charge and beyond. The only explanation, I believe, and again, I haven't played this book in a long time, the only explanation is that Harry is once again a member of the TARDIS crew, with no explanation as to how he got there. So there is one officially licensed Doctor Who work that has Harry Sullivan post Tom Baker's regeneration.
The fact that this book makes a point of saying Harry is not an imbecile. I love the fact that it goes out of its way to at the very, very end, when he's speaking to his friend and all of the colleagues and all of the top brass that he's been trying to convince of the conspiracy, and it's basically the whole point of it is Harry's not an imbecile. However, it is entirely possible Harry rejoined the crew of the TARDIS, got lost, and was only recently rescued by the Sixth Doctor and Perry. So maybe that's how it came about. He's just been wandering the corridors all these years. I was about to make our usual joke of don't give Big Finish any ideas, but they are doing this exact thing with Harry Sullivan with later Doctors. So I haven't heard them yet. I'm sure they're great. The fellow who does Ian Marter's voice, or Harry's voice, is very good. In those missing or alternative versions they've done. It's a very good sound alike.
So adapting some questions that we like to ask on this show, is this the definitive Harry Sullivan book?
Yes. Yes. It's absolutely brilliant. It's not entirely told from Harry's point of view. I know that, again, Ian Marter considered writing this in the first person, which would have made it even more like the 39 Steps. I'm glad he didn't do that. And there are about 5 scenes that are told from other people's points of view. But mainly, it's predominantly Harry's point of view, which means we get a lot of his interior monologue, a lot of his insecurities. He recognises that he's out of his depth, but it's recognisably the Harry that we saw on screen, just 10 years older.
And with a little more military and civilian experience under his belt. Yeah. If somebody has not read a Doctor Who book before, and you were giving them a target book from the 1980s to introduce them to the line, is this book a good starting off point? Is this a good first Doctor Who book for somebody?
I'm aware that I said this last time, that every book could be someone's first book. On the one hand, I think this book goes out of its way to make it very easy to understand that this man met the Doctor, he met the Brigadier, he knew Sarah Jane Smith, he's encountered Daleks and Cybermen, and now he's back in civilian life. So it explains it all to enough of a degree that you don't need any more. If you're aware of basic Doctor Who, you could start with this. I would say, I would recommend not starting with this because I'm not saying it's the best Target book, but in terms of favourites, it's in my top one.
Huh.
This is the book. This and Day of the Daleks and Remembrance of the Daleks and The Ark in Space are the 4 books that I think I've read the most. And bearing in mind, I read this particular book again yesterday for this podcast. And I was still picking up on things that I'd missed when I read it 2 years ago for my blog. I really like, despite the fact that, yes, it does have some flaws, but I think the flaws are actually intentional. Like in the main villains, the acronym that when we found out the full scale of the conspiracy, the acronym for the organization is earache.
That I missed. That I managed to miss.
Because you got the Anti-Chemical Hazard Environment Society, which is ACHES, and then they add another part of the acronym at the beginning, and it's earaches. But that's no more or less stupid than SMERSH or Spectre. And actually, I think that makes a little bit more sense because it shows they're human and they've got a sense of humour about it all, while also being part of a big global conspiracy. I would have loved to have seen what earache could have evolved into in a further book, but anyway.
I think SMERSH.
You probably get the impression I like this book, so.
SMERSH makes sense to me. I mean, it's a portmanteau of 2 different Russian words, and it has a distinct meaning. Whereas Spectre, that's talk about reverse engineering your acronym. Somebody really wanted a cool sounding word like Spectre, and they just mashed as many improbable and illogical words together until they reach the end result.
It's like that scene in the Pandorica Opens where the Doctor's surrounded by all of the villains they can get costumes for in the Underhenge. And me and my friends at the time were joking that maybe they've come together under an umbrella title of the Federation of Evil Alien Races, or FEAR for short.
Which reminds me of a line in the first episode of the Marvel Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. TV series where somebody points out that they really, really wanted to spell S.H.I.E.L.D., and that was the acronym they ended up with. Strategic Homeland Intervention. I forget the entire acronym now because I haven't watched that show in a while, but the acronym sort of invents itself. You've already made moot my next question, which is this the best of the 3 Companions books? Because you've decided this is the best of your Target books of all time.
We can get into that though as well. Yes, it is. But that's also a bit of an unfair comparison because this is a really good book. I have a great affection for K9 and Company, which is probably based on just the fact that it exists. Again, I know Terence Studley comes in for a lot of criticism. That's somebody else's job when you come to that in the podcast. But Taylor, this is like if you got these 3 books, this is the best. Taylor and the Earthling Dilemma is the worst thing ever committed to print, and then K9 and Company is somewhere in between. And your mileage may vary on where that is, but this is easily the best of the 3. It's also, I think, one of the best of this year, and it's also one of the best of the range. But in terms of personal preference, as I say, it's my top one.
The Target Book Club podcast also slated the K9 and Company novelization, but that ended up being good for me because one of their panelists boycotted all Terence Dudley books after K9 and Company, which led to my appearance on the show for the Black Orchid episode. And that's a book that I happen to enjoy, although that's not coming up for quite a ways for Doctor Who literature. It's at least 6 weeks in the future. But,
and even though I made that very personal, I should say that they're a lovely bunch. Every time I listen to the show and every time I'm a guest on it, especially Alison has this way of approaching these so fresh, and she always comes out with something that I had not considered. I was quite critical and quite down on Castro Valva, which your guest Graham Burke rightly criticised me for. But when I heard Alison's review of Castro Valva, she described it in ways I hadn't considered at all, and made me suddenly reevaluate the book. So Alison and Dalton are brilliant.
I have tried to make this a positivity podcast, and obviously I completely fail at certain times. Although I did get a nice email from you for trying to be generous and fair-handed about the Turlo and the Earthling Dilemma book, which I ended up having to read that book in all of one day because of bad scheduling on my part, and that was the longest day of my life. That is not a book that is easily read, full stop, but it's also not a book that is easily read in a single day, and I managed to do it. And I'd be charitable about it, too.
Yeah, but I think, again, some people may approach that book and go, this is what I want from a spin-off book. But I've yet to meet that person. So, but again, I've got a real love for this book, and I've met people who just don't have it. They don't get it. But again, in the last year, I've been going back and filling in gaps in my own knowledge. So I've been reading John le Carré Smiley novels and getting a new appreciation for those. And I've read the 39 Steps and realised what that's like. But I haven't actually read all the Bonds. I've not read any Agatha Christie. There's loads of big gaps in my knowledge that I'm trying to fill.
Well, we're going to have to bring you back for books that challenge the genre and extend your boundaries. Unfortunately, you've been on the show almost every other week for the last 3 months, and it's been a blast. But your next book after this one is about 4 months down the road, give or take, depending on how many bonus episodes I do. So, Jim, it is going to be weird doing this show without you, but I understand we have several more of your audio contributions, as was heard earlier in this episode.
Yeah, I really wanted this book to have a theme tune, so I've been experimenting with GarageBand, and I decided I wanted to have something a little bit like A View to a Kill, without it being necessarily that like A View to a Kill. So it's kind of in the same way that this book is a pastiche of James Bond. My song is a pastiche of Duran Duran. Unfortunately, by the time I'd recorded it, I actually got COVID. I know you've had this in your folder for about a year, so this was last year when I fell ill, and I just desperately wanted to record it. And I've got a friend, Anthony Owen, who's an amazing singer, and I just went, I want you to do this. You can do these vocals much better. I wanted someone with a bit of power. So Anthony recorded the voices for me. Thank you so much for that, Anthony. And it was such a lovely experience working with him on this that we've done another song which will be coming up way in the future.
This show has just about a year to go before I run out of original Target books, and you have already recorded the songs for several of them. So I will not spoil which song in the future it is, but we have a lot of good content from you waiting to go. Jim, you and I earlier were comparing notes on the text, and of course I had my audio essay, which will fall on the other side of the break, but you had made an observation which had completely gone over my head. And that's a fair point, because you have read this book more than any other, and I have read this book less than any other, except for Slipback, which I have yet to open, which is also coming up on the show fairly recently. So I'm going to give you credit, and I'm not going to poach it for the audio essay. Who is Professor Gold, and what does this book have to tell us about Professor Gold's jewelry, and why is that?
I don't know whether I'm reading too much into this, but knowing that Ian Marter got told off for shoehorning in jokes that were sometimes a bit obvious, sometimes very sexual. But, he's called this character, there's a character that he names, I can't remember the name of the head of the Admiralty, but basically it translates as Slotburger, if you translate it from the German. And I think that's possibly Ian Marter making a dirty joke and getting away with it. But, so he calls this character Gold. Now, he might be a little bit sensitive going, is he making a Jewish comment here? Is Gold going to be a Jewish character? Especially because of what turns out to be his makeup. And then I realised that in one line, and it's one of the scenes where it's not Harry's point of view, it's Gold's point of view. And the narrator draws attention to a signet ring And I'm pretty sure the only reason, apart from making a connection to maybe the jewelry of Smersh members, maybe he was making a connection to that. But it just struck me that he's drawn attention to the signet ring just so that he can draw attention to Gold's finger. Wah, wah, wah. That just strikes me as a thing that he must be doing.
My apologies to the audience. No, seriously, I think that's actually a good point. Ian Marter, when he was adapting Enemy of the World, after David Whitaker passed away in mid-draft of his novelization of Enemy of the World, the Donald Bruce character, towards the end of the story, asks somebody to call his assistant at extension 001. In the novelization, Ian Marter changes that to 007 as the telephone number to make it the most obvious James Bond pastiche this side of the Woody Allen Casino Royale. This is somebody who definitely had James Bond on the brain. And when you're writing a spy novel, there are other points, as you say, about Harry Sullivan's home address and about other scenes that might be a lift from various James Bond adventures. That cannot be a coincidence. It just can't be.
I think this is so beautifully crafted because, as you just said, I've probably read this book more than any other book ever. For some reason, it's just one of those comfortable reads that I think, I'll just read this again. I'll just do it one more time. But reading through it this time, there are a few little things that I picked up that I hadn't recognised because I hadn't read the 39 Steps. So, for example, Harry's apartment is in St John's Wood, and it's described as being the Regent's Park end, which means that Harry's apartment is on the opposite end of Regent's Park to Langham Place, where Richard Hannay's apartment is in the 39 Steps. And then something I noticed when I was doing the blog was when Harry is in prison, he's in Wormwood Scrubs, and he has a view out of his window on the scrubland, the parkland, the field behind the prison. And if his cell was on the opposite side of the prison, it would have been looking at TV Centre. It would have been looking at the back of TV Centre.
Oh, wow.
And White City, which is where I used to work, and I used to walk around that field when I was trying to lose weight. So I'm quite familiar with it. I was always worried that maybe there would be an escaping prisoner trying to break out. But again, I think that was just because I'd read Harry Sullivan's War too often.
There was a licensed James Bond novel about 10 years ago, and the official James Bond license has cycled through a lot of one and done authors ever since Raymond Gardner gave up the mantle. Sebastian Faulks did a book. I believe it was Anthony Horowitz who did a series of James Bond novels before the torch passed to a different author recently. But I believe the book is Trigger Mortis. And in the book, somebody is trying to detonate a nuclear weapon in Herald Square in Manhattan, which is very close to the enormous Macy's, the biggest department store in the world, and a very popular tourist hub. But the bomb is loaded aboard a subway train in Coney Island, which is the origin point for a lot of New York City subways. And the bomb wends its way through Brooklyn into Manhattan. James Bond, in this novel, is following the subway on motorcycle. He then details the path of the book. I'll say that differently. He details the path of the chase all the way through the last few chapters of the book. James Bond literally zips his motorcycle directly past the street corner on which I live. And then shortly afterwards, he does and I can only explain this by having you stand on the subway platform. In the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn, he has James Bond jump his subway from the street to the elevated subway platform, a move which is literally impossible because of the way the platform is built, and then jump on the train that way. And this is a subway stop that is part of my daily commute. So the closest that I've ever gotten to James Bond is in one of the officially licensed non-Ian Fleming novels. But Ian Fleming, Ian Marter, it all fits together.
I mean, there's even and again, I mentioned this in my blog, there's a reference to when Harry is waiting to find out if he's going to be released from prison. Where's it gone? Where's it gone? There's a reference to Algernon, someone Algernon, which feels like it's going to be a reference to a real-life person who was actually the inspiration for James Bond. But then he gives him the name Algernon Flowers, so it might just be a reference to a lab mouse, which is also relevant to Harry Sullivan's experience. But, flowers for Algernon. I'm wondering whether that's a connection to that as well. It was Algernon Osborne Willis, who is the fellow who's believed to be the real-life inspiration for 007.
Huh.
Or a lab mouse. But I've got the most obscure connection I'm going to make, and then I think I'm going to bow out because this is so protracted. When Harry takes the cipher code to his friend Percy, and we're told it's a 4-digit cipher code, and that's very similar to the real-life codes that were used in World War I by the British intelligence. And the man in charge of those codes, and by the way, pretty much everything I'm telling you now, I was told by Simon Guerrier about 10 years ago, because he blew my mind with this, because of where it ends up. So the head of the cipher division was a fellow called Leo Marx. He's like a 24-year-old Jewish British guy. And he comes up with a new way of doing ciphers. And just as it's about to be installed, he comes up with another one. And he's brilliant. If I were ever going to write a Doctor Who story, he would be my real-life person I'd be shoehorning in to have him in there. He's a really interesting character. After the war, he decides he wants to become a writer. And he ends up writing the script that nearly destroyed the career of Michael Powell, Peeping Tom.
Oh.
And then the film was reviled, the critics hated it, and then 6 months later, Psycho comes out. And suddenly, Hitchcock's Psycho is revered, and everyone's saying how brilliant it is. And Michael Powell's scratching his head going, what did we do wrong? Because our film's better than that, and it is. It's a brilliant film. But many, many years later, Martin Scorsese paid for a restoration of Peeping Tom, and suddenly it got a critical reappraisal. Everyone suddenly recognized it as a classic. So as a thank you, Leo Marx voices Satan in The Last Temptation of Christ.
Oh, wow.
So this is where it gets really protracted. Leo Marx is the son of the owner of a bookshop that used to be in London's West End, Marx and Company, otherwise known as 84 Charing Cross Road, the bookshop that was made internationally famous by a book by a Jewish New York writer called Helene Hanff. And actually, 84 Charing Cross Road is the closest contender to Harry Sullivan's War for the book I've read the most often.
Huh.
I always try and bring it round eventually. There's the link.
I know of 84 Charing Cross Road. Have not read it. We'll have to add it to my reading list.
It's
I was
very
gonna
easy.
say,
You'll
though,
read it in a day. You'll read it in a day.
I want to reset a factoid that you dropped on episode 71, our Full Circle recording, because we're talking about Full Circle, which has a James Bond in it. George Baker, who was the voice of James Bond for 30 minutes in On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Yes.
George Baker's granddaughter, Kim Sherwood, is the current licensed James Bond novelist following Anthony Horowitz. So there are many interwoven connections between Doctor Who and James Bond, and between all these various writers and our mutual interests.
And of course, in this book, having played around and hinted at it, finally when Harry tells a ticket inspector on a train going back to King's Cross about his exploits, and he says, I've just escaped from a car which crashed, and I was driven off the road. And the ticket inspector says, 1 single to King's Cross, Mr. Bond, in a very sneery way, just to really hammer home, yes, we know. But right from the very beginning, Ian Marter is saying that this is just a string of coincidences, which is pretty much what most James Bond books are. That, so we have to follow the trail to Bermuda. Why Bermuda? Because it's in the script. That's why. Or we have to follow the train out to India. Why? Because on the last movie we were getting these elephants and we needed to pay for shoes for the elephants to be able to perform on the tarmac. So we need to then use those shoes. So we need a scene in India. That's why. So although it's all very, very improbable, I think Harry Sullivan's War sews it all together a lot better than Ian Fleming. I think that's such a brave thing to say. This is where I probably have to say goodnight. So, this is the real reason why I'm not going to be back for a while.
Jim, always a pleasure. Thanks to you so much for your contributions, and we will have you back very soon. Not as soon as this appearance was compared to your last one, but I have you on the schedule for a trial of the Time Lord book coming up in about 4 months' time on this show. And of course, we are going to hear a lot more of your musical contributions before that.
Thank you very much. Oh, and everyone, check out the video on YouTube. There's a video of that theme tune. So I've been very silly.
And coming up after the break, my much less effusive review of Doctor Who: The Companions, Harry Sullivan's War by Ian Fleming. I mean, Ian Marter. The Companions of Doctor Who, Harry Sullivan's War by Ian Marter. Paperback release date, October 16th, 1986. Cover artist, David McAllister. It is 10 years since Harry Sullivan left UNIT and gave up his travels in the TARDIS with the Doctor and Sarah Jane. Since then, he has been engaged in top-secret work, developing antidotes to nerve toxins. But when he is transferred to Yara in the Hebrides to work on weapons research, he has severe misgivings. For one thing, it goes against much of what he believes in. For another, someone is out to kill Harry Sullivan. Who wants Harry safely out of the way? What significance does a painting by Van Gogh have in the affair? And can Harry's old friend, the Brigadier, really be involved in a scheme which threatens the security of the Western world? I'm so glad Jim Sangster was my guest for this episode, for multiple reasons. I've had the exact opposite experience with Harry Sullivan's War. As we discussed earlier, I'd never read the book before last month, when I rushed through it in order to time my recording the interview. The book's a bit of a foreign language for me, full of English and Scottish geography, which I wouldn't know without Google Maps or Wikipedia, and tons of slang that even now, after all this time immersed in Doctor Who, is still strange and unfamiliar to me. But it was page 131 of the book that jumped out the most. Remember? One of the villains in the book is named Gold, which, as Jim acknowledged, is most familiar as a Jewish surname. Here's the passage. A flurry of shots rang out as Gold fired at the package and then at Harry in his momentary confusion. A bullet tore the package apart in the air, and suddenly 100-pound notes were flying everywhere, caught up in the gusty breeze. Next minute, the pistol was kicked from Gold's hand by a fusillade of machine pistol fire. With a shriek of panic, Gold started grabbing at the snowstorm of valuable notes whirling all around him. Within a few seconds, he was surrounded by Sawyer's men, and he collapsed onto his knees, sobbing and whining as he clutched armfuls of crumpled notes against his chest. Okay, that is a lot to take in. And it hurts. A character with a Jewish surname, last seen in defeat, pathetically clinging to a pile of banknotes, money, cash, while whining? Every bad stereotype about my people would seem to be encapsulated in that one paragraph. But, and I can't stress this enough, I do not think this is intentional. I do not think this is a reflection of Ian Marter gleefully perpetuating the worst anti-Semitic stereotypes. That would be the internet. For example, just follow Michelle Trachtenberg from Buffy the Vampire Slayer on Instagram, and look at the flood of horrible comments on her social media feed whenever she wears her Curb Your Anti-Semitism hoodie in a photo, or anything that Musk posts or retweets on Twitter. No, I think this passage about Gold is there because this is a spy novel, a James Bond pastiche, or send-up or parody, depending on your point of view, James Bond as a genial, bumbling spy instead of a hardened killer, Ian Fleming's self-professed blunt instrument. You have Gold's finger, as Jim pointed out. Passages in the book seem to echo earlier Bond print fiction, and at Chapter 10 a disheveled Harry, fleeing from some chase or dust-up or other, is on a train knowingly called Mr. Bond by the conductor. And you can't write or discuss Fleming without pointing out virulent anti-Semitism in his fiction. Book 1, Chapter 1 of the whole Bond canon, Casino Royale, one of Bond's first questions about the evil Le Chiffre. Is he Jewish? In Goldfinger, Bond is brought into the plot by his rich American friend Mr. DuPont, not merely because Goldfinger is cheating at cards at an expensive hotel, but because that hotel is restricted, and his last name is Goldfinger, so Jews are not allowed in the hotel. And that whole passage in Thunderball about how you can tell which bankers are evil depending on what are their last names. Now, of course, Fleming is a multi-offender. Anti-Semitism is only one of his many, many bad habits, but it should be acknowledged and pointed out. Of course, not to mention the anti-Semitic slurs I saw on the socials last week when the biannual rounds of Aaron Taylor Johnson as James Bond casting rumors came back around. But again, as I've said before, 6 people in the comments section are not fandom at large, and the ATJ rumors are still merely rumors, so let's turn back to Harry Sullivan's War. This is not the Ian Marter book you're expecting. There is no science fiction in it, apart from a couple of references to the Doctor, and one very funny reference to Davros, which a government official instantly recognizes. It's also not a horror book, which is a neat left turn for Marter to take, as almost all of his earlier Target novels were characterized by effective body horror, harsh language, and violent imagery. No, this is a straightforward spy thriller, with intrigue, chases and escapes, femme fatales, double crosses, lots of double crosses, enemies who seem like friends, and friends who seem like enemies, but a very light body count, shockingly light body count, and almost no body horror. Nobody vomiting up blood after getting shot in the stomach, for example. So while this is a Target book with the Doctor Who logo, it is very out of keeping with the Target range. Very. As you'll expect in any James Bond story, there are 3 women in the book, or 4, depending on your point of view, but that's a spoiler. There's that femme fatale who shows up in the guise of a friend. There's the eventual love interest, over whom Harry doesn't seem especially enthused. And that love interest at one point appears to be an enemy as well. There's a single chapter cameo for Sarah Jane Smith, and yes, Harry let slip that he did harbor romantic feelings for Sarah Jane at one point. But this is Harry Sullivan as we know him best. As I mentioned to Jim earlier, I strongly believe there are elements of autobiography in Harry Sullivan's War. Not a Marty Stew situation, but Harry turns 41 during the book, and Marter would have been 41 when he wrote this. We know from the eventual novel version of Scratchman, which began life as a film script co-plotted and co-written by Marter, that there was a long sequence of Harry's inept comic bumbling saving his life several times, all in that same chapter. Definite echoes of that sequence in Harry Sullivan's War. Chapter 2, for example, Harry on a date in the National Gallery, bumbling and fumbling his way through the encounter, both physically and verbally. When you go back and watch Season 12 now, it's hard not to see misogynist overtones to the Harry Sullivan character, though Marter plays him so well, and Liz Sladen plays off him so well, that you always forgive him. All credit to Ian Marter for making that work through the whole book. Again, Harry involved with 3 women, or 4, but never lustful, or super enthusiastic over any of them, and never takes his clothes off. Is this a great book? I don't think so, but then again I'm reading when I'm nearly a decade older than its protagonist and writer, and it's hard for any book to be truly great if you don't discover it at age 11 and then grow old with it. At times, Harry Sullivan's War feels like the outline of a novel rather than a full book. Most of the characters are names only, not people. That goes for Teddy Bland, who's nominally Harry's best friend, or the Brigadier, who's shown only fleetingly and mostly under a cloud of suspicion, or Sir Algernon Flowers, who, yes, I'm sure is a deliberate reference to the Daniel Keyes short story and then novel and film, but Sir Flowers is not an actual character, again, just a name on the page. Harry's trips and excursions in the book are often told rather than shown, short summaries of what in a 300-page book might have been more satisfying set pieces or vignettes. But even if the Brigadier is only here as a cameo, Marter, who famously named his Soviet Air Force base in the invasion, episode 98 of this podcast, Nikortny, here seems to name-check the Brigadier and his actor twice. There's a fictional, well, I believe fictional, chemical named Nykor, Nykor, the same first 5 letters as Nikortny Air Force Base, then a rock formation called, and pardon my Gaelic, Brigadier, B-R-Y-G, space A, space D-Y-R. And it seems churlish of me to point this out, but there is perhaps one continuity error in the book. The Doctor recalls that his last trip, or his last meeting with the Doctor and Sarah, is against the Zygons, and that would be a reference to Terror of the Zygons, or, if you will, Doctor Who and the Loch Ness Monster, episode 18 of this podcast, and that forgets that Harry was last seen on television in the Android Invasion. Although, again, perhaps this is not a continuity error, but rather just the fervent belief that Android Invasion is not part of the Doctor Who canon. The book's climax takes place on the Eiffel Tower. The final chapter appears to end on a cliffhanger, a literal cliffhanger. 2 men, similarly dressed for a black tie reception, are battling on the iron lattice of the structure, and one falls to his death, and for a page or two the other characters lead us to believe this is in fact Harry, until he shows up, bruised and heavily bandaged, in the epilogue. A very View to a Kill, the most recent Bond film when this book came out. Harry Sullivan's War is a unique experiment for the Target line, even more so than Turlough and the Earthlink Dilemma, which was a hard sci-fi time travel epic, so to speak. No, Harry Sullivan's War is a spy novel with no science fiction, apart from those continuity references, and thus is even more of a straight book than most of the novelizations of historicals, in which the TARDIS is a major plot point, a la Marco Polo, or where alien characters appear in prologues or epilogues, a la The Massacre, which we are coming to on this show. Ian Marter died less than 2 weeks after the book came out, and we would never see another one like it. 1986 was an incredible year for Doctor Who fiction, not only with a novelization every month, but with the first 2 of the 3 Companions books, and some bonus fiction, which we're coming to shortly. Well, one of them at least. Not every book published in 1986 is particularly good, but Marter is one of the most skilled writers on the calendar for the year, and fear not, Terrance Dicks is coming up again in a few more weeks. But we're not even done with the 1986 books, so unlike Harry Sullivan, racing his little red sports car through Scotland, being pursued by evil Romanians or Jamaicans, again, tell me this is a spy novel without telling me this is a spy novel. Unlike Harry Sullivan racing that red sports car, fasten your seatbelts. This crazy 1986 Doctor Who literature ride is not over yet. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer of Doctor Who Literature is David Barsky. This episode was produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. The episode was written and edited by me. The episode is dedicated to the memory of Pat Zachary, a pitcher for the New York Mets between 1977 and 1982, who passed away yesterday as I record this, and will be discussed in a future episode of Doctor Who Literature. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Jim Sangster. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's Dr. Who Literature, @gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.